New York. A chilly late autumn afternoon. Sparse rays of sunlight pierced through the tall trees lining the streets, creating an atmosphere both gloomy and mysterious. Young police officer Emma Scott was patrolling a bustling street in Brooklyn, her usual area of duty. For her, it was just another day at work. But little did she know, today would mark a turning point in her life. Emma, with her slender yet resolute figure in her police uniform, was walking along the sidewalk when a scene caught her attention. An elderly black woman, around 70 years old, was curled up on the side of the road, wearing tattered clothes and a pale expression. She appeared to be unconscious. Emma immediately approached, her professional instincts kicking in without hesitation. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she said, gently shaking the woman's shoulder. No response. Her heart began to race. In a matter of seconds, she realized the woman was in danger. She quickly used her radio to report the situation while checking the woman's breathing and pulse. Weak, she thought to herself, promptly deciding to act. Emma called for an ambulance and knelt beside the woman, holding her hand tightly as they waited for help to arrive. Passers-by began to gather, curiously watching the scene. Some whispered, "Why did she collapse here? Is she homeless?" Emma paid no mind to the murmurs. All she cared about was saving the woman. When the ambulance arrived, Emma climbed in alongside her, staying by her side on the way to the hospital. The hospital was as busy as ever. But for Emma, time felt like it had come to a standstill. She sat in the waiting room, her eyes constantly fixed on the door to the emergency room. Will she make it? She wondered, her heart heavy with worry. In that moment, she realized that, even though she didn't know who the woman was, she felt an inexplicable connection to her. Emma decided to stay at the hospital until the elderly woman regained consciousness. The doctor informed her that the woman was simply exhausted and malnourished, needing rest and recovery. Hearing this, Emma breathed a sigh of relief. Even though her shift had ended, she felt she couldn't leave. Sitting beside the hospital bed, Emma watched the woman as she slept. The wrinkles on her face seemed to tell a long story full of ups and downs. Her worn-out clothes, frail hands, and weary appearance hinted at a life that had been far from easy. Emma wondered to herself, who is she? Why was she alone on the street? A few hours later, the elderly woman began to stir. Her eyes opened slowly, a flicker of confusion crossing her face as she saw a young woman in plain clothes sitting by her bed. "Who are you?" she asked weakly. Emma smiled gently and said, "I'm Emma Scott, a police officer. I found you collapsed on the street and brought you here. How are you feeling?" The woman looked at her for a long moment, her gaze softening. "Thank you. You're very kind," she said, grasping Emma's hand. Her hand was trembling but warm. Emma felt a strange connection, as if the woman were somehow part of her family. During their conversation, the woman revealed only her name, Margaret, but didn't share much about her family or why she had collapsed on the street. She simply mentioned that she lived alone and didn't want to trouble anyone. Emma could sense the loneliness and sadness in her words. Before Emma left, Margaret said something that stayed with her. "Always listen to your heart. It will guide you to the right path." Although Emma didn't fully understand the meaning, she felt that those words carried a special power. After returning from the hospital, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. The image of the elderly woman with sad eyes lingered in her mind. Over the following days, she tried to gather information about Margaret but found very little. Margaret seemed to be a mystery, leaving no trace in the police database. One morning, while at work, Emma received an unexpected call from the hospital. The doctor informed her that Margaret had left the hospital, leaving a note for Emma. "Thank you for everything. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." Emma felt a pang of disappointment. She didn't want Margaret to find herself in a dangerous situation again. Where could she have gone? Emma wondered, her heart heavy with concern. A few days later, while on patrol, Emma unexpectedly spotted Margaret walking along a small street near the market. Margaret didn't seem to recognize Emma immediately, but when Emma called her name, Margaret's eyes lit up. "Emma, what are you doing here?" she asked, surprised. Emma smiled softly. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay. You shouldn't be walking around so much while you're still recovering." Margaret smiled in return, though her eyes still carried an indescribable sadness. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me. But I'm very grateful to you." Emma tried to persuade her to share more about her family or where she lived. But Margaret simply replied briefly, "My past doesn't matter anymore. I just want to live in peace." A week later, while Emma was working at the police station, she received an unexpected call from the office of the mayor of New York City. The caller informed her that Mayor John Johnson wanted to meet with her. Emma was stunned, unable to understand why someone so important would take notice of her. When she arrived at City Hall, a secretary escorted her to a large conference room where Mayor Johnson was waiting. He was a middle-aged man with a composed demeanor and sharp eyes. But today, those eyes also held a trace of emotion. "Hello, Officer Scott," the mayor began. "I want to thank you for what you did for my mother." Emma froze, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Your mother?" she repeated. "Yes," he said gently. "Margaret is my biological mother. Thanks to you, I learned that she had been in trouble." Emma could hardly believe it. It turned out that Margaret, the humble and mysterious woman she had met, was the mother of the mayor. A whirlwind of confusion, surprise, and emotion swept through her. "I was just doing my duty," she said quietly. Mayor Johnson smiled. "You didn't just save her. You gave me a chance to make amends. Thank you, Emma." From that moment on, Emma knew her life would change in ways she had never imagined. Emma had always been someone who preferred to work in the background. She believed in quiet, dedicated service to her community. But the events of the past few days had catapulted her into a spotlight she neither wanted nor expected. The story of her saving Margaret Johnson, the mother of New York City's mayor, had caught the attention of the local media. What began as a small human interest piece quickly spiraled into a full-blown media sensation. Reporters crowded outside the precinct, waiting for a chance to ask her questions. Headlines in newspapers read, "Hometown Hero, the cop who saved the mayor's mother." Social media buzzed with praise for Emma's selflessness, and strangers began recognizing her on the street. At first, Emma tried to ignore the attention. She avoided interviews and turned down requests for public appearances. But her superiors at the precinct had a different perspective. Captain Morrison called her into his office one morning, his stern expression betraying the pride he felt. "Scott," he began, motioning for her to take a seat. "You've done something extraordinary. People need to see the good side of law enforcement, especially now. This is your chance to represent the badge in a positive light." Emma hesitated. "Captain, I didn't save Mrs. Johnson to get recognition. I did what anyone would do." Morrison leaned forward, his voice softening. "Not everyone would have gone the extra mile like you did. You're a good cop, Emma, and people need to know that. Think about it." Despite her reservations, Emma agreed to participate in a press conference organized by the mayor's office. The event was held in front of City Hall, with Mayor John Johnson himself introducing Emma to the public. As she stepped onto the podium, a sea of faces and cameras greeted her. Her heart raced. "Emma Scott is not just an officer," the mayor said, his voice resonating with emotion. "She's a symbol of hope and compassion in a world that often feels divided. Thanks to her, my mother is safe, and our family is whole again." When it was her turn to speak, Emma kept her remarks brief and genuine. "I didn't expect to be here today," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "What I did wasn't heroic, it was human. We should all look out for one another, regardless of who we are." The crowd erupted in applause, but Emma felt a pang of discomfort. This wasn't what she signed up for. As the press conference ended, she resolved to refocus on her duties and stay grounded. A few days after the press conference, Emma received an unexpected call from Margaret Johnson. The elderly woman's voice was warm and inviting. "Emma, dear," Margaret said, "I'd like to invite you to dinner at my son's house. It's the least I can do to thank you properly." Emma hesitated. She wasn't accustomed to mingling with high-profile individuals like the mayor and his family. But Margaret's sincerity won her over. "I'd be honored," Emma replied. That evening, Emma arrived at the mayor's residence, a stately brownstone in an affluent neighborhood. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by the warm aroma of home-cooked food and the sight of Margaret standing by the door, her face lighting up with a smile. "You made it," Margaret said, embracing her like an old friend. Emma felt an unexpected sense of belonging. Dinner was an intimate affair, with only the mayor, Margaret, and a few close family members in attendance. The dining room was elegant but not ostentatious, reflecting the Johnson family's grounded values. As they ate, Margaret began sharing stories from her past, some lighthearted, others deeply personal. Emma learned that Margaret had grown up in the South during the height of segregation. She spoke of the challenges she faced as a young Black woman and the sacrifices she made to provide a better life for her children. "Life wasn't easy," Margaret admitted, her voice tinged with melancholy. "But it taught me resilience." The mayor, who had been mostly quiet, finally spoke. "Mom doesn't talk about it often, but she's the reason I'm here today. Her strength shaped me, and I owe her everything." Emma felt a deep respect for Margaret and her family. By the end of the evening, she realized that this invitation wasn't just about gratitude, it was about trust. Margaret had opened a window into her life, and Emma felt honored to be a part of it. As Emma grew closer to Margaret, she began to sense that there was more to the elderly woman's story than she had revealed. Margaret often spoke in riddles, hinting at unresolved conflicts and long-buried pain. One afternoon, Emma visited Margaret at her modest apartment. It was a cozy space, filled with old photographs and trinkets that told the story of a life well lived. Margaret was sitting by the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. "Do you ever think about the past, Emma?" Margaret asked suddenly, her voice distant. Emma paused. "Sometimes, but I try not to dwell on it. The present is hard enough to handle." Margaret chuckled softly. Wise words for someone so young. But the past has a way of catching up with us, whether we like it or not. Margaret then opened a small box on the table beside her. Inside were faded photographs and letters. She handed one to Emma, a picture of a young Margaret with a little boy who looked strikingly like the mayor. "That's John," Margaret said, her voice softening. "He was my pride and joy, but life took us in different directions. There was a time when we were estranged, and I feared I'd never see him again." Emma listened intently as Margaret recounted the rift that had once divided her family. She spoke of misunderstandings, societal pressures, and the difficulty of bridging generational divides. Emma realized that Margaret's journey was one of reconciliation and healing, a journey that mirrored the challenges Emma faced in her own life. Back at the precinct, Emma's newfound fame began to affect her career. While some of her colleagues were supportive, others were less kind. Officer Mike Daniels, a senior member of the team, made his disdain clear. "Look who's the golden girl now," Daniels sneered one morning as Emma entered the locker room. "Must be nice having the mayor on speed dial." Emma ignored the comment, but it stung. She had worked hard to earn her position, and the idea that her achievements were now overshadowed by her connection to the Johnson family frustrated her. Captain Morrison, however, was determined to make the most of Emma's positive image. He assigned her to a high-profile community outreach program, hoping to strengthen public trust in the police force. While Emma was hesitant at first, she soon realized the program's potential to make a real difference. Her first assignment was to lead a workshop at a local youth center, teaching kids about safety and conflict resolution. The experience was both challenging and rewarding. As she interacted with the children, Emma felt a renewed sense of purpose. But the challenges at work were far from over. A series of troubling incidents in the neighborhood hinted at a deeper problem brewing beneath the surface. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something that might put not just her, but the Johnson family in danger. The air was crisp and tense in Brooklyn that week. While Emma's public profile had risen, her instincts as a police officer kept her grounded and wary. Strange occurrences in her neighborhood and the precinct began to raise alarms. Several petty crimes seemed coordinated, almost like distractions from something bigger. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that these were pieces of a larger puzzle. One evening, as Emma finished her shift and walked to her car, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Its tinted windows obscured any view of the interior, but she could feel the weight of someone's gaze following her. When she approached her vehicle, the sedan's engine roared to life, and it sped off before she could catch its license plate. The next morning, an envelope was waiting for her at the precinct. No return address, no markings, just her name typed on the front. Inside was a single piece of paper with a typed message. "Stay out of things that don't concern you. This is your only warning." Emma's blood ran cold. Was this connected to her newfound proximity to the mayor and his family? Or was it something more sinister? She reported the incident to Captain Morrison, who urged her to remain cautious but not jump to conclusions. "We'll investigate," he assured her. But Emma knew better than to wait passively. Someone had singled her out, and she intended to find out why. Emma spent the next few days quietly digging into recent criminal activities in her district. What she found was troubling. A series of robberies targeting small businesses had been reported, all carried out with precision and efficiency. The stolen goods were never recovered, and the perpetrators seemed to vanish without a trace. More disturbing was a rumor circulating among her informants. A powerful syndicate was operating in the city, using these crimes to mask their true agenda. Emma's investigation led her to cross paths with an unlikely ally, Detective Carlos Vega, a seasoned officer known for his work on organized crime. Carlos was skeptical of Emma at first, dismissing her as the rookie with a press badge. But as Emma presented her findings, his demeanor shifted. "You're saying this isn't random?" Carlos asked, leaning back in his chair. Emma nodded. "The pattern is too deliberate. Someone's testing our response times, gauging how much they can get away with." Carlos frowned. "If that's true, we're dealing with something much bigger, and I don't like where this is heading." Their collaboration uncovered a shocking link. Several of the small-time criminals arrested in connection with these incidents had ties to prominent figures in the city's business and political circles. Emma couldn't help but wonder if this corruption extended to the mayor's office. She hated to think that John Johnson, a man she had come to respect, could be implicated. But the evidence suggested that someone close to him might be involved. One night, as Emma reviewed case files in her apartment, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It read, "Your persistence is a problem. Meet me at Pier 14 if you want answers. Come alone." Emma debated whether to involve her colleagues but ultimately decided to follow the lead herself. She tucked her service weapon into her holster and drove to the deserted pier. The waterfront was shrouded in fog, and the faint sound of waves lapping against the docks filled the air. As she stepped out of her car, a shadowy figure emerged from the mist. It was a man in his 40s, dressed in a sharp suit that contrasted with the grim setting. "Officer Scott," he said, his voice smooth but menacing. "You've been asking too many questions." Emma's hand instinctively moved toward her holster. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man smirked. "I'm just a messenger. But if you don't back off, you'll find out who sent me in the worst way possible." Before Emma could respond, the sound of footsteps behind her made her whirl around. Another man, armed with a crowbar, lunged at her. Emma's training kicked in, and she sidestepped the attack, pulling her weapon and firing a warning shot into the air. The two men hesitated but didn't retreat. "Leave now," Emma commanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Or you'll regret it." The men exchanged glances before retreating into the fog. Emma watched them disappear, her adrenaline still surging. She knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, Emma reported the incident to Captain Morrison, who ordered additional security measures for her. But as the day unfolded, Emma noticed something unsettling. Her colleagues were treating her differently. Whispers followed her through the precinct, and a few officers seemed to avoid eye contact. It wasn't until Detective Vega pulled her aside that she understood why. "Emma," he said, his tone cautious, "I think someone in the department is leaking information." Emma's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Carlos handed her a folder containing surveillance photos from the pier. "These were taken before you arrived last night. Someone knew you were going there." Emma's mind raced. The only people who knew about her investigation were those within the precinct. Was there a mole among her colleagues? Her thoughts immediately turned to Officer Mike Daniels, whose disdain for her had been palpable. But she couldn't jump to conclusions without proof. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma began reviewing internal communications and cross-referencing them with the incidents she had been investigating. What she found was damning. An email chain from an anonymous account linked directly to Daniels. The messages contained detailed information about police schedules, locations of patrols, and even Emma's personal movements. Confronting Daniels was a risk, but Emma knew she couldn't wait. That evening, she cornered him in the locker room. "You've been selling us out," she accused, holding up the evidence. Daniels sneered. "You don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me." "Daniels, I have the emails. I can take this straight to Morrison." Daniels' face twisted with anger. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You don't know what you're up against. They'll chew you up and spit you out." Before Emma could respond, Daniels shoved past her, slamming the door behind him. She knew she had to act fast. She reported her findings to Captain Morrison, who immediately suspended Daniels and launched an internal investigation. But the damage was done. Emma realized that the corruption she was fighting was deeper and more entrenched than she had imagined. And now, she had a target on her back. The suspension of Officer Daniels sent shockwaves through the precinct. Emma had expected some resistance from her colleagues, but the fallout was worse than she imagined. Some officers whispered behind her back, calling her a snitch. Others outright avoided her. The precinct, once her second home, now felt hostile and cold. Despite the tension, Emma pressed on with her investigation, working closely with Detective Carlos Vega. She began piecing together the connections between the small-time crimes, the criminal syndicate, and the leaks from within the precinct. Every thread seemed to lead back to a shadowy figure known only as Vanguard, the supposed leader of the syndicate. Carlos revealed that Vanguard had been on law enforcement's radar for years, but had evaded capture through meticulous planning and bribery. "Whoever Vanguard is," Carlos said one evening as they pored over case files, "he has friends in high places. Daniels was just a pawn." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "If we can find Vanguard, we can dismantle the entire operation." Their breakthrough came when they intercepted a shipment tied to the syndicate. Hidden among crates of electronics were ledgers detailing bribes paid to various city officials. Emma's stomach churned as she scanned the names. One stood out: Michael Carter, the deputy mayor. The revelation was devastating. Deputy Mayor Carter had been a close ally of Mayor Johnson for years, and his betrayal would shake the administration to its core. Emma knew she had to tread carefully. Exposing Carter without concrete evidence could ruin not just her career but also the mayor's reputation. As Emma wrestled with the implications of her discovery, Margaret Johnson called her unexpectedly one afternoon. Her voice was calm but firm. "Emma, I need to see you. It's urgent." When Emma arrived at Margaret's apartment, the older woman was sitting by the window, a stack of old photographs and letters spread out before her. "I've been thinking," Margaret began, her gaze fixed on a photo of her younger self. "About the past, about the mistakes I made." Emma frowned. "Margaret, you've done nothing wrong." Margaret shook her head. "There's something I haven't told you, something that might help your investigation." She handed Emma a letter, yellowed with age. It was addressed to Margaret but written by someone named Victor Tanner, a name Emma didn't recognize. In the letter, Victor spoke of a business partnership that had gone sour. He accused Margaret of betraying him to protect her son, John, who had unknowingly become entangled in Victor's illegal dealings. Margaret explained that Victor had been a close friend of her late husband, but greed had driven him to crime. "I thought I'd left all this behind," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "But I've heard whispers that Victor changed his name. If he's still alive, he might be Vanguard." Emma was stunned. Could Vanguard, the elusive crime boss, be someone from Margaret's past? The possibility added a personal dimension to the case, one that Margaret was clearly struggling with. "Margaret," Emma said gently, "you don't have to carry this burden alone. Let me handle this." But Margaret shook her head. "If Victor is Vanguard, he'll recognize me. I can draw him out." Emma's heart sank. The thought of Margaret putting herself in danger was unbearable. But the older woman's resolve was unshakable. "I've spent my life protecting my family, Emma," Margaret said. "This is my fight too." The plan was set. Margaret would attend a charity gala where Victor Tanner, now going by the alias Vincent Gray, was expected to appear. Emma and Carlos would provide covert security, with backup teams stationed nearby. The gala, hosted by the mayor's office, was the perfect cover for drawing out Vanguard. Emma watched Margaret enter the grand ballroom, her posture regal despite the weight of the task ahead. The room was filled with politicians, socialites, and business leaders, all unaware of the danger lurking among them. Emma's earpiece crackled as Carlos's voice came through. "Target spotted. East corner." Through the crowd, Emma saw him, a man in his late 60s with sharp features and a commanding presence. Vincent Gray exuded wealth and power, his every movement calculated. Margaret approached him with surprising confidence, her expression unreadable. "Vincent," she said, her voice steady. "It's been a long time." Gray's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "Margaret," he replied smoothly, "I didn't expect to see you here." Their conversation was polite on the surface but laced with tension. Emma could see Gray's guards hovering nearby, their eyes scanning the room. She signaled Carlos, "Get ready. He's on to us." As Margaret continued to engage Gray, Emma and Carlos moved into position. Suddenly, Gray's expression darkened. "You've been meddling, haven't you?" he hissed at Margaret. Before she could respond, Gray signaled his guards. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed as armed men appeared, blocking the exits. Emma drew her weapon, her heart pounding. "NYPD, drop your weapons," she shouted. A firefight broke out, the ballroom descending into pandemonium. Emma and Carlos fought their way through the chaos, determined to reach Margaret. Amid the gunfire, Margaret grabbed a microphone and shouted, "Victor Tanner, or should I say Vincent Gray, is Vanguard. You can't hide anymore." Gray's face twisted with rage. He lunged for Margaret, but Emma intervened, tackling him to the ground. Backup arrived moments later, subduing Gray's men and restoring order. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind. Vincent Gray was taken into custody, and his arrest led to a cascade of revelations about the syndicate's operations. Dozens of corrupt officials and business leaders were implicated, including Deputy Mayor Carter. For Emma, the victory was bittersweet. She had exposed a network of corruption and brought a notorious criminal to justice. But the cost had been high. Margaret, though unharmed, was visibly shaken. "You saved me, Emma," she said as they sat together in the hospital waiting room. "And you saved John's legacy." Mayor Johnson publicly thanked Emma, calling her a hero. But Emma's thoughts were with Margaret, whose courage had been instrumental in bringing Vanguard down. In the weeks that followed, Emma found herself reflecting on everything she had learned. Margaret's strength, Carlos's loyalty, and her own determination had been the key to unraveling the syndicate. But more than that, She realized that her work wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about protecting people, even when it meant putting herself in harm's way. Margaret, too, found a sense of peace. The burden of her past had been lifted, and her relationship with John was stronger than ever. "You gave me a second chance," she told Emma one evening over tea, "and I'll never forget it." As the city began to heal, Emma returned to her work with renewed purpose. She knew the fight for justice was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Together, they had made a difference, and that was enough. The city was slowly returning to normal after the shocking events at the gala. The arrest of Vincent Gray, now publicly revealed as Vanguard, had sent shockwaves through New York's political and business elite. News outlets buzzed with updates about the syndicate's dismantling, and the city seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But for Emma Scott, the work was far from over. Sitting at her desk in the precinct, Emma sorted through a mountain of paperwork related to the case. Each arrest tied to Vanguard had spawned its own investigation, and Emma found herself juggling interviews, witness statements, and follow-ups with the DA's office. Despite the overwhelming workload, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For the first time in months, she felt like her efforts were making a tangible difference. Detective Carlos Vega stopped by her desk, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said, placing one in front of her. Emma smiled gratefully. "You're a lifesaver." Carlos leaned against her desk, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've worked on organized crime for over a decade. I've seen guys like Vanguard slip through the cracks more times than I can count. What you did, it was extraordinary." Emma shook her head. "It wasn't just me. Margaret, you, the whole team, we all played a part." Carlos chuckled. "You're too modest, Scott. Most people would have walked away the moment things got personal. You didn't. That takes guts." As Carlos walked away, Emma allowed herself a rare moment of pride. She had faced danger, corruption, and betrayal and emerged stronger for it. But she also knew that the city's problems wouldn't vanish overnight. There were still people who needed help, and she was determined to be there for them. Margaret Johnson had always been a woman of quiet strength, but the events of the past few weeks had brought out a side of her she hadn't felt in years. For too long, she had carried the weight of her past mistakes and the rift with her son. Now, as she sat in her modest apartment, sipping tea with Emma, she felt a sense of closure. "You know," Margaret said, her voice warm, "I never thought I'd see a day like this, to have my past come back in such a way. It's been a journey, hasn't it?" Emma nodded, her gaze steady. "It's been a journey for both of us, but I think the hardest part is behind us." Margaret smiled, reaching for a stack of letters on the table. "I've been thinking about the future, Emma, about what comes next." The letters were responses from community organizations Margaret had contacted, offering to share her story and mentor young people. She wanted to use her experiences to inspire others, to show them that redemption was possible. Emma felt a swell of admiration for the older woman. Margaret's courage and resilience had not only helped bring down a criminal empire but also opened a new chapter in her own life. Later that week, Margaret joined Emma at a community center where the police were hosting an outreach event. Margaret shared her story with a room full of young people, her words resonating with hope and determination. Emma watched from the sidelines, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the woman who had become like family to her. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a new normal for Emma. The precinct returned to its usual rhythm, though the lingering impact of the Vanguard case was still felt. Several officers were promoted for their roles in the investigation, including Detective Carlos Vega. Emma, however, declined a promotion, choosing instead to remain on the front lines. "Why would you turn down a desk job?" Carlos asked one day, clearly baffled. Emma grinned. "Because I didn't become a cop to push papers. I became a cop to make a difference out there." Her decision earned her the respect of her colleagues, even those who had once doubted her. Emma's work in the community continued to expand, and she found herself becoming a trusted figure in her neighborhood. Whether it was mentoring at-risk youth, helping small business owners recover from the syndicate's reign, or simply being a reassuring presence, Emma embraced her role wholeheartedly. Margaret, too, flourished in her new life. She and her son, Mayor Johnson, had mended their relationship, and Margaret became a frequent guest at City Hall events. But she never forgot her roots, often returning to the community that had shaped her. One evening, Emma and Margaret sat together on the stoop of Margaret's apartment building, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "You've come a long way," Emma said softly. Margaret chuckled. "So have you, my dear. You've become the person this city needs." Emma felt a lump in her throat. Margaret's words reminded her of why she had joined the force in the first place: to serve, protect, and uplift. Months after the gala, Emma received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from a young woman named Leah, one of the teens Margaret had mentored at the community center. Leah wrote about how Margaret's story had inspired her to turn her life around. She had been on the verge of dropping out of school but had decided to stay and pursue her dream of becoming a social worker. Emma shared the letter with Margaret, who was deeply moved. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Margaret said. "How one small act of kindness can ripple out and change so many lives." Emma thought back to the day she had found Margaret on the street. What had seemed like a simple act of compassion had led to a chain of events that changed not only her life but also the lives of countless others. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Listen to your heart. The ripple effect of their choices. Emma's decision to help a stranger, Margaret's decision to confront her past, had created waves of change. And while the work was far from over, Emma knew that together, they had made the city a better place. As Emma walked through the bustling streets of Brooklyn that evening, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The city was imperfect, chaotic, and full of challenges, but it was also vibrant, resilient, and filled with people worth fighting for. Emma knew she couldn't fix everything, but she could do her part, and sometimes that was enough. The lights of New York sparkled against the night sky, and Emma allowed herself a small smile. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but it had also been worth every step. This was her city, her home, and she was proud to be a part of its story.